Mysterious murder in the neighborhood. Prologue. The rain was relentless, transforming the quiet suburban street into a series of dark, glistening puddles. Yellow police tape fluttered in the cold wind, cordoning off the Mitchell's house from the rest of the world. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something more sinister, something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. My name is Sarah Lawson. I'm a detective and have witnessed more tragedy and violence than I care to remember. But nothing prepared me for what I saw that morning. Emma Mitchell's body lay in the living room, her once lively eyes now wide open, staring at the ceiling, her face frozen in a look of terror. The room was eerily silent, the only sound a muffled murmur from the neighbors gathered outside, whispering in shock and fear. As I stood there surveying the scene, I felt a familiar pang of despair and curiosity. It was my job to sift through lies and uncover facts, to find the witness with the key to this puzzle. Chapter 1. The Discovery. It was early morning when I got the call. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost routine, but I sensed the underlying tension. A body had been found in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where the biggest event was usually a lost cat or a noisy teenager. The scene was chaotic when I arrived. Yellow police tape flapped in the wind, keeping the Mitchell's house separated from the growing crowd of onlookers. Uniformed officers struggled to maintain order, but the panic was palpable. Flashing my badge, I ducked under the tape and entered the house. Emma Mitchell's body lay on the living room floor. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, her face frozen in terror. There were signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, shattered glass. She had fought her attacker, but it wasn't enough. I took a deep breath, pushing my emotions aside. I needed to focus and find the clues that would lead me to her killer. The room was eerily quiet. The only sound, the distant hum of neighbors gathering outside, whispering in shock and fear. I began my investigation, starting with the examination of the body. Bruises on her wrists and neck indicated a violent struggle. Blood stained her clothes and the carpet beneath her. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms showed she had fought fiercely. "Detective Lawson?" I heard a voice from the doorway. I turned to see Officer Blake, one of the first responders. "We've secured the area and started questioning the neighbors. No one saw anything, at least no one's admitting to it." I nodded. "Thanks, Blake. Keep at it. Someone must have seen or heard something." Blake nodded and left, leaving me alone with the body. I crouched beside Emma, my mind racing. Who could have done this? And why? I moved around the room, carefully checking every detail. The coffee table was overturned, and a vase lay shattered on the floor. Marks on the walls suggested a struggle. I found a piece of fabric clenched in Emma's hand. It looked like it came from a dark jacket. I photographed everything, ensuring I missed no detail. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, could be crucial. As I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about Emma. She was a nurse, someone who dedicated her life to helping others. Who could hate her enough to do this? When I finished documenting the scene, I stepped outside to talk to the neighbors. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and cold. The small crowd of onlookers parted as I approached, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Chapter 2. The Neighbors. My first stop was the Thompsons, an elderly couple who had lived on the street for over 30 years. They were the type who noticed everything but rarely spoke up. Mrs. Thompson greeted me at the door, her face etched with worry. "Detective, this is such a tragedy. Emma was like a daughter to us." "May I come in?" I asked, and she stepped aside, allowing me into their meticulously kept home. Mr. Thompson sat in the living room, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea. The room was warm and smelled of freshly baked cookies, a stark contrast to the cold, wet world outside. "We heard a noise last night," he admitted. but we didn't think much of it. There have been a few break-ins in the area, you know. Did you see anyone? I asked, keeping my voice gentle. No, Detective, Mrs. Thompson replied. We were in bed early. But Emma, she was so kind. I can't imagine who would want to hurt her. I made a few notes. Did Emma ever mention feeling unsafe? Did she talk about anyone who might want to harm her? Mrs. Thompson shook her head. No, she never said anything like that. She was always so cheerful, so full of life. I thanked them for their time and moved on to the next house where Catherine Miller, a single mother, lived. Her young son clung to her leg, looking at me with wide, silent eyes. Catherine looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. I heard a noise, a loud bang, she admitted, casting a nervous glance at her son. But I thought it was just the wind or something outside. I didn't think it was something like this. Can you tell me more about the noise, Kat? I asked. What time was it? How long did it last? It was around midnight, maybe a little later, she said, her voice trembling. It was just one loud bang, and then everything was quiet again. I didn't hear any voices or anything else. I nodded, jotting down her words. Thank you, Catherine. If you remember anything else, please let us know. Next, I visited the Joneses, a young couple who had recently moved in. Mark Jones ran a hand through his hair, looking shocked. We didn't hear anything, Detective. We were watching TV all night. Emma was always so nice to us. This is terrible. His wife, Linda, sat on the couch, clutching a pillow to her chest. I can't believe she's gone, she said softly, almost whispering. She was always so cheerful. Who could do this? Did either of you notice anything unusual last night? I asked. They both shook their heads. No, nothing, Mark said. We watched a movie and went to bed around midnight. I thanked them and moved on to the last house on my list, an apartment rented by Tommy Evans, a student living directly across from Emma's house. He was nervous, his eyes darting around as he spoke. I didn't see anything. I had my headphones on, studying for an exam. But Emma, she was always so nice to me. I can't believe this happened. Did you notice anyone unusual in the area recently? Anyone who might want to harm her? I asked. Tommy shook his head. No, nothing like that. But there was one guy. I saw him a few times hanging around. He looked suspicious, but I didn't think much of it. Can you describe him? I asked, my interest piqued. He was tall, pretty slim, wearing a dark jacket. I saw him a few nights ago just walking around. I couldn't get a good look at his face. I made a note of the description and thanked Tommy for his time. Each interview left me with more questions than answers. Everyone had heard something, seen something, but no one had a clear picture of the events leading to Emma's death. I had to dig deeper, find the gaps in their stories. Chapter 3. Hidden Truths. Back at the station, I delved deeper into Emma's life. Going through her records, I discovered she wasn't as perfect as she seemed. She had secrets, dark secrets. She had financial troubles, and rumors swirled about a turbulent relationship with an ex-boyfriend who had a criminal past. I decided to interview Emma's family and friends, hoping to gather a fuller picture of her life. Her sister, Julie, was devastated. She clutched a tissue, tears streaming down her face. Emma was so strong, so independent, Julie said, her voice trembling. She never wanted to worry anyone, but I knew something was wrong. She hadn't been herself lately. Did she mention receiving any threats? Did she talk about anyone who might want to hurt her? I asked gently. Julie nodded. Yes, she said she was getting some strange messages. She thought they were just pranks, but I could tell she was scared. She didn't want to go to the police. She thought it would make things worse. Do you have any idea who might have been sending those messages? I asked. Julie shook her head. No, she never said. She tried to ignore it, but I could see it was affecting her. Next, I visited Emma's parents. Her mother, a frail woman with sad eyes, showed me Emma's room. It was neat and organized, a stark contrast to the chaos downstairs. On her desk, I found a journal. Emma had written about her fears, anxieties, and suspicions. She mentioned a man she had seen lurking around her house, a man she recognized but couldn't remember from where. I took the journal back to the station and pored over it, cross-referencing every name, every detail. I called in reinforcements, checked records, and slowly, patterns began to emerge. Emma had been in contact with someone from her past, someone she had tried to leave behind. I decided to visit Emma's ex-boyfriend, Jake. He had a history of violence and had done time for assault. When I knocked on his door, his surprise was evident. "What can I do for you?" he asked, clearly taken aback. "Detective Lawson," I said, showing my badge. "I need to talk to you about Emma Mitchell." His face paled and his surprise turned to cautious concern. "Emma? What about her?" "Can I come in?" I asked, my tone leaving little room for refusal. He stepped aside, allowing me into his cluttered apartment. The place was a mess, reflecting a chaotic mind. We sat down, the tension in the room thick. "She was found dead last night," I said bluntly. "I need to know where you were." Jake's eyes widened and genuine shock crossed his face. "Dead? Emma's dead?" "Where were you last night?" I asked again, my tone unyielding. "I was at a hockey game last night. My friend plays for a local team and I always go to support him when I can," Jake said, looking at me with slight embarrassment, indicating he meant he hadn't been able to support anyone recently because he'd been in jail. "Can anyone verify that?" I pressed. He nodded slowly. "Yes, a lot of people were there. I even have a video from the end of the game showing me there," he said, handing me his phone. It was true. Jake had been at the hockey game last night. At least that's how it appeared. Leaving Jake's apartment, I felt a pang of disappointment. He wasn't the breakthrough we were hoping for, and the case remained as tangled as before. Chapter 4. Dead Ends. I followed several leads, each more frustrating than the last. Emma's ex had an alibi, solid and verified. The threats turned out to be pranks, unrelated to any real danger. The more I dug, the more it seemed everyone had a motive, but no one did. One night, exhausted and frustrated, I sat in my car outside Emma's house. The street was dark and quiet, the houses casting long shadows in the moonlight. I thought about my own life, how I ended up here chasing ghosts and shadows. My husband left me 2 years ago, tired of the long hours and constant danger. My daughter was in college, barely speaking to me. My career was all I had left. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus. This wasn't about me. It was about Emma, and I owed it to her to find her killer. The next morning, I got a call from the lab. They had found something, a partial fingerprint on the piece of fabric I had collected from Emma's hand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I spent the next few days chasing down every lead, following every shadow. I interviewed more neighbors, checked surveillance footage, and tracked down every clue. But each lead went nowhere, leaving me more frustrated and exhausted. One afternoon, going over my notes, I received a call from Officer Blake. "Detective, you need to see this," he said urgently. I met Blake at the station, where he showed me surveillance footage from a nearby store. The footage showed a man matching Tommy Evans's description, lingering outside the store around the time of Emma's murder. "That's him," Blake said. "That's the guy Tommy described." I watched the footage again, feeling a surge of hope. This could be the break we needed. Chapter 5. New Leads. I called Tommy back to the station for another interview. This time I pressed harder, asking for more details about the man he had seen. "Are you sure you didn't recognize him?" Anything that could help us identify him? I asked. Tommy shook his head, looking nervous. No, sorry. I didn't get a good look at his face. I showed him the surveillance footage. Is this the man you saw? Tommy leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Yes, I think that's him, but I'm not sure. I felt a mix of frustration and determination. We were close, but not close enough. I needed more. That evening, I returned to Emma's house, hoping to find something we had missed. I went through each room, carefully checking every detail. In the bedroom, I found a small box hidden under the bed. Inside were letters, hundreds of letters, all from the same person. I sat on the floor, reading through the letters. They were from a man named David, someone Emma had met years ago. The letters started sweetly, but over time, they became increasingly obsessive and threatening. One letter stood out. It was dated a week before Emma's murder. In it, David wrote about seeing Emma again, about how they were meant to be together. He mentioned knowing where she lived and couldn't wait to see her. A chill ran down my spine. This was it. This was the lead we needed. I ran a background check on David and discovered he had a history of stalking and violence. He had been arrested multiple times but always managed to avoid serious consequences. I called Officer Blake and told him to bring David in for questioning. This time, we had enough to detain him. In Chapter 6. In the confrontation. With a team of officers, I approached David's apartment. It was a nondescript building in a part of town that had seen better days. David opened the door, his surprise quickly turning to irritation. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp and hostile. "David, we need to ask you a few questions about Emma Mitchell," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Emma? What about her?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. "She was found dead last night," I said flatly, watching his reaction. "We have reason to believe you were involved." David's face turned pale. "Dead? Emma's dead?" "Yes," I continued, my gaze unwavering. "We found letters from you in her house. You threatened her, stalked her. We have enough to bring you in for questioning." David's expression shifted from shock to anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snarled. "Emma was mine. She loved me, but she was afraid to admit it." "Please come with us, David," I said, signaling the officers. At the station, David sat across from me in a stark interrogation room, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. "You killed her because she didn't return your love. You couldn't handle the rejection," I accused, pressing him. "You don't know anything," David shouted, rage contorting his features. "Emma never rejected me. I didn't kill her. I was home all day. Prove otherwise. And you know what? You won't be able to, because I'm innocent." The interrogation dragged on for hours, grueling and frustrating. David was clearly disturbed, but we lacked solid evidence against him. The love letters weren't enough, and the surveillance footage didn't reveal anything distinctive. In the end, we had to release him. But I decided to keep him under surveillance, determined not to miss any detail. In Chapter 6. In the confrontation. With a team of officers, I approached David's apartment. It was a nondescript building in a part of town that had seen better days. David opened the door, his surprise quickly turning to irritation. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp and hostile. "David, we need to ask you a few questions about Emma Mitchell," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Emma? What about her?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. "She was found dead last night," I said flatly, watching his reaction. "We have reason to believe you were involved." David's face turned pale. "Dead? Emma's dead?" "Yes," I continued, my gaze unwavering. We found letters from you in her house. You threatened her, stalked her. We have enough to bring you in for questioning." David's expression shifted from shock to anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snarled. "Emma was mine. She loved me, but she was afraid to admit it." "Please come with us, David," I said, signaling the officers. At the station, David sat across from me in a stark interrogation room, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. "You killed her because she didn't return your love. You couldn't handle the rejection," I accused, pressing him. "You don't know anything," David shouted, rage contorting his features. "Emma never rejected me. I didn't kill her. I was home all day. Prove otherwise. And you know what? You won't be able to. Because I'm innocent." The interrogation dragged on for hours, grueling and frustrating. David was clearly disturbed, but we lacked solid evidence against him. The love letters weren't enough, and the surveillance footage didn't reveal anything distinctive. In the end, we had to release him. But I decided to keep him under surveillance, determined not to miss any detail. Chapter 7. Truth Revealed. The morning was crisp, a thin layer of frost covering the ground as I walked to the station. A week had passed and the investigation had stalled. Frustration gnawed at me. I needed to find the missing piece that would unravel this mystery. I decided to go through the case files one more time. There had to be something we missed. I had gone over the documents so many times I felt I knew them by heart. During this last review, a small detail caught my attention. Something in one of the photos from Emma's house seemed off. I stared at it, knowing the key to the puzzle was there. Despite my concentration, the answer eluded me. Then it hit me. One of the photo albums on Emma's shelf was missing. Suddenly I remembered seeing a similar album elsewhere, a small but crucial detail that had escaped me until now. I grabbed my phone and dialed the station. "I need a patrol now," I said urgently. "We're making an arrest. I'll text you the address." The drive seemed endless, thoughts racing through my mind. When I arrived, patrol cars were already in place, engines idling quietly like silent sentinels. We moved quickly, the cold air biting as we approached the modest house. "Come, police, don't move, I shouted, the door crashing open under our force. Inside stood a man, his eyes wide with fear. We had him in handcuffs within moments. On a shelf I saw the album identical to the ones in Emma's house. We seized it as evidence, my instincts telling me this was the breakthrough we needed. Back at the station, the suspect sat across from me in the sterile interrogation room. The walls seemed to close in on us, their stark whiteness amplifying the tension. Tommy sat hunched over, his hands trembling, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. Clearly out of his depth, a trapped animal caught in the harsh light of reality. I watched him for a moment, letting the silence build, knowing it would only heighten his anxiety. Finally, I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "Tommy," I began, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Tell me about Emma. These photos show you've known each other for a long time." He nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "We grew up together. I always liked her. More than liked her. I loved her." There was raw honesty in his voice, a painful vulnerability that cut through the tension. I saw the boy he once was, longing for a love that was never returned. "What happened, Tommy?" I pressed gently, needing him to say the words. He looked at his hands, his voice barely a whisper. "I went to see her," he stammered, each word heavy with regret. "I wanted to ask her to be with me, but she laughed. She said we were just friends." His shoulders shook, reliving the moment, the humiliation and heartbreak etched in his memory. I lost control. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to see how much I cared." The room seemed to chill as the truth settled over us. His confession hung in the air, a dark cloud of despair. "You killed her in a fit of rage. I said softly, almost a whisper. You couldn't bear her rejection. Tommy broke down, the weight of his actions overwhelming him. His sobs were loud and unrestrained, a raw outpouring of guilt and sorrow. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing a torrent of pent-up emotions. I watched him, feeling a mix of pity and anger. He was both a victim and a perpetrator, a tragic figure caught in the web of his own making. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, the small town began to heal. The close-knit community, bound by shared grief, found solace in their unity. And I moved on to the next case, but Emma's story stayed with me. In this job, you carry the shadows with you, but some lights are snuffed out too soon to ever forget. On a somber afternoon, I visited Emma's grave. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with impending rain. I laid a single white rose on the cold, damp ground. Rest in peace, Emma, I whispered, my voice carried away by the wind. We found him. He can't hurt anyone else now. As I walked away, I felt a mix of closure and lingering sadness. Emma's life had been tragically cut short, but her memory lived on in the hearts of those who loved her. Her story was a stark reminder of why I do this job, why finding the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth the effort.